those who are watching this, watching the recording, to a roundtable session on what we'll call responsible AI systems and experiences. And we attach that term systems and experiences to try to connote that it's a broader topic than just purely the technical details. And we'll consider that in this set of questions. So we have a fantastic group of folks to join us. And as I was mentioning earlier, just in a private side of the chat, was that we were hoping to grab some people that were outside of the data management community, or at least on the periphery of the data management community, who maybe don't do their work only in the data management community, to hear that outside perspective. In part, I think this is because this is a good idea, because I'm not sure that, you know, as a database person, there's only so many of us that are diving into the space, and it's kind of increasing. I think we lag behind, say, machine learning and some of the other areas, but also because there are some aspects of the connection between this technology and society that the database community, I think, could benefit from hearing perspectives about. Okay, so I think how we'll do this is we'll let folks give their own introductions around, and so just your name and where you're from, and maybe one or two sentences about your interest in this space, or your the things you care about in this space, and then we'll roll through these questions that I've sent around, and we can maybe post those in chat too if people want to review them, and see where the discussion takes us. I do want to make sure we leave time for some of the ones at the end, though, because they're among my favorites. So we'll see. Well, I'll try to keep us moving along in time. But that's the goal. We don't necessarily have a set format here. So I'll hand it off maybe. So we have a couple folks from Maryland. Katie, do you want to start, and then Hal?
Yeah, hi, I'm Katie Shilton. I'm an associate professor in the information school at the University of Maryland in College Park. And my research is in tech and data ethics broadly, and I'm the PI of the Pervade project, which is a 6-campus project focused on empirical questions in big data ethics. So trying to figure out what the people documented in big data expect in terms of data reuse, what's actually happening on the ground in terms of researcher best practices and norms, and then how it's all being regulated by things like IRBs, although not exclusively. So that's kind of my interest in this area. And I'll pass to Hal.
Hi, I am Hal Dame. I'm a professor at University of Maryland in computer science, and also a researcher at Microsoft Research in New York. And I guess my background is mostly on the language side of things, where we've been using large data for a while, and it's sort of getting larger and larger all the time. There's a lot of recent issues that have been popping up around, like, what does it mean when we're sort of gathering all the data we can find and trying to build models?
Gulnush?
Sure. Hi, my name is Gulnush Karnadi, and I'm an assistant professor at HEC Montreal, which is a business school of University of Montreal. I'm a core academic member at MILA, which is the AI Institute in Quebec, and I'm a CIFAR AI chairholder in Canada for my work on trustworthy AI. My background is mainly machine learning, and in the past couple of years, I've focused on fairness and algorithmic discrimination. And in general, I'm actually interested in questions around trustworthy AI systems, like how we can design systems that are trustworthy and what aspect is fairness, but I'm also interested in the intersection of fairness, explainability, robustness, safety, and privacy.
Thank you. Bernice?
Sure. Hi, I'm Bernice Herman. I am a research scientist at the University of Washington eScience Institute. And the eScience Institute is a kind of campus data science institute that really focuses on data-driven discovery across all domains. So we have biologists and astronomers and lots of folks, especially in STEM, but even expanding outside of that. My interest is primarily in kind of the places of evaluation and explanations and augmentation of data for AI systems, and really interested in how we can operationalize these things, how, you know, the ability to perform those at scale really have impact and allow us to take our responsible AI research and parlay that into impact into industry. And yeah, I'm really interested in lots of sort of things in this larger responsible AI space.
Jen?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm definitely not a databases person, but I'm really excited to get to meet this great group of people. I'm Jen Wortman Vaughn. I am a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York City. My background is in machine learning, actually originally on the learning theory side, but these days, most of my research focuses on responsible AI and specifically transparency, intelligibility, and fairness, usually from a human-centered perspective. Within Microsoft, I'm part of the FATE group for fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in AI, along with Hal as well. I'm also involved with Ether, which is Microsoft's company-wide initiative that's focused on research-driven practices for responsible AI. Within Ether, I co-chair a working group on transparency, where we think about communication with customers and other stakeholders on characteristics and limitations of AI, as well as intelligibility or explainability. And I'm also involved in working groups on fairness and inclusiveness and human AI interaction and collaboration.
Fantastic. Yuval?
Hi, my name is Yuval. So I'm a postdoc at the University of Michigan in computer science, where I work with Jagdish. And I started working on topics in fairness and responsible data science during my postdoc. My high-level goal is to make data-driven decision system more reliable, and this include the development of tools that assist users in the developing process of such systems. So the analysis of data in different points, making sure the data match or fits the needs of the users, assessing the quality of result generation during the data analysis, and detection of unfairness.
All right, real quick, actually, Abol, do you want to give a quick introduction as maybe the two of us can do that as the.
To make it very short, Abol here, I'm assistant professor at UIC. I'm very excited and thank you for accepting the invitation. I can't wait to hear from you. Thank you.
And my name is Bill Ham at the University of Washington, and I've been working in this space for a few years here, trying to figure out where the right home is. We spend a lot of time thinking about public interest technology and try to think about applications for some of this work. Okay, let me kick it off here. So given that this is DLDB, one of a few, a handful of premier data management database conferences, maybe we'll start off with just what role can data management systems play in facilitating these topics that we've all talked about here, given that it's, perhaps it's sometimes thought of as a machine learning problem first, and then the other things as peripheral. We tend to think of a little bit further upstream in the data lifecycle. Where do you see problems that we can work on as research questions emerging? And maybe maybe I'll call on folks here too as well. Katie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. So I think that data management systems is critical for thinking through how to enact responsible AI. And that's because the context in which data is made and managed and used are critical to its responsibility, to its ethics, to its social responsibility. Context is inseparable from this issue. And so the more we can do to preserve the context of data as it is both, as it is generated, as it's made, as it's collected, as it's adapted and adopted and cleaned, and all of these sort of steps that go on in order to be useful, the better we can do sort of ethical reflection about like, what does this data really mean, and who's documented in it, and what biases might it have, right? So so this is actually an easy pass to Hal. Hal, I didn't see you were going to be on here, and I was like going to talk about context documents for data and data sheets for data, but I think that that's one of these critical pieces. So Hal, do you want to talk about data sheets and maybe other things?
Actually, I was going to let Jen talk about data sheets. Jen wanted to talk about data sheets, but I maybe I'll just slightly echo and make a twist on something Katie said, which is I think, I came to machine learning from sort of NLP, which was originally more separate from machine learning than it is today. And the joke that we had in grad school was, in machine learning, you pretend God or whatever gave you a matrix, and your job is to do something with this matrix. And I think that this abstraction has been really useful in some ways, like it's enabled a lot of development of useful technology and so on. But I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing now are like exactly because of this abstraction, that we've completely forgotten where this matrix came from and like what we should be doing with it. And so I think these, like one thing that Katie mentioned in passing, but I'd like to sort of like bubble up a little bit, is this sort of like provenance question as data makes its way through various pipelines. So like one of the things that we see in a lot of NLP systems is, you know, people download, for instance, the Common Crawl, which is, you know, several terabytes of data, and then do lots of stuff to it to get, you know, several hundred gigabytes of data on which they train a model. And like that lots of stuff makes a lot of difference. So like, I guess a shout out to Anna Rogers' paper, like changing the data by changing the world, or maybe it's the other way around. But I think like that's exactly the question that I think we need to think a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a long history of work in both data provenance and somewhat more recently workflow provenance. That really came out of the e-science community, you know, 15 years ago and now, but the database community sort of works on that now. This may be the killer application for some of that, because I think the overheads involved haven't always been worth it in my opinion. But here, as you guys pointed out, it's absolutely critical to maintaining context. Bernice, did you want to chime in there? I know you've had some.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well,
Okay.
half of it was data provenance, so I'll leave that one alone. But the other one is really, I mean, I personally think that explaining and evaluating AI and ML systems is a major component of building responsible systems and communicating, you know, these systems to those that they may impact. And so I think the evaluation of these systems really needs to move to the location of the data in the database and be embedded in those systems for a number of reasons. I mean, the cost of data transfer is very high in and of itself. There's lots of reasons to kind of move to the database. To normalize these kind of evaluation practices, we see things like benchmarks, which are a step toward that, where we have the data stored by one person. They do that evaluation in a system, but I really think that there's some innovations in databases and that databases are the right place for these sorts of things. And then I think another important one is the multiple comparisons problem. So this is the problem of, you know, multiple researchers working on the same data set, trying to come up with some conclusions about the data. And there's so many researchers working on the same very few data sets that we have lots of spurious results. And I think there's already, you know, problems that the database community have grappled with. So for example, in differential privacy, you already have this idea of a privacy budget and thinking about the particular queries and limiting your ability to kind of do more queries beyond that. And I think that databases is a great place to kind of do this evaluation for machine learning broadly and AI.
I mean, this is great. You know, one of the reasons why the database community exists is, you know, observe requirements that show up in multiple applications and then try to figure out how to push those down to the database so you don't have to rebuild them 5 times. And so it could be that some of the things that we're talking about are on deck for being pushed down into the database. So this is fantastic. The other comment I thought I'd make to see if you guys nod your heads or not would be, you know, I've made a sort of a joke where I'm only 40% kidding that databases are becoming training set management systems, right? I mean, it's, you know, in some sense, every application out there is going to be some form of training a model to make some sort of a prediction, in which case we need to take that as a first class requirement rather than a corner app that we don't really care about. You know, the transaction processing things that we did in the 90s is not the main thing that people are doing with all this data anymore. So, you know, embrace that rather than look the other way. So let's see. So we already touched on this a little bit. You know, in this area of responsible AI, and there's I've had some reaction from folks. I'll just say Emily Binder pointed out that it's not really the AI we necessarily want to make responsible. it's perhaps the people. So is there a fundamentally new vision for what this technology should look like that is somehow earning the moniker responsible, or is it more of a refinement of how we use these things? And it's more of a, you know, like one idea that I've heard that I like, and I sometimes use in talks, is that it's almost a QA or a debugging process at some point. Some of these things should have never been let out into the wild without even a basic sanity check of whether they're functioning as intended or have any other unintended consequences. And yet that process is wholly absent from the engineering pipeline. So maybe it's just a matter of improving the engineering process or professional practice as opposed to developing brand new technology. So I think the folks in the room are better equipped to talk about that than I am. Jen, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree that technical tools alone are not going to solve these socio-technical problems that we have in responsible AI. I also think that it's hard for individual people to try to solve these problems without having a lot of support from their institutions and from leadership and processes as well. So I would frame this a little bit differently, actually, and say that what we need is not, responsible technical tools, but we need better processes for this. Just to give you one example here, in order to be able to assess whether an AI system works better for some demographic group than others, it's necessary to do something like run a disaggregated evaluation in which system performance is measured separately for different groups of people, right? So this is a really straightforward idea, but there are all of these different dimensions that need to be worked out in order to run one of these disaggregated evaluations. And there are all these different choices that need to be made, and it's not really clear how to do this, right? So what demographic groups do you want to prioritize for this type of evaluation in the first place? How do you define these groups? This is a question that's actually, domain dependent, so it will look really different for something like speech compared with vision, and it's often not straightforward. Once you've narrowed down these groups, there are other questions like, how do you collect appropriate data? And there are a ton of trade-offs here to do with privacy, consent, costs, and all of these things. What metrics do you use? They're just kind of endless dimensions. And what I found working with teams at Microsoft is that there's this real need that people building systems have to have processes in place that can help them kind of think through these decisions and figure out how to set priorities, how to even think about these decisions in the first place. Just to mention one more example quickly, because this came up earlier, people were bringing up data sheets for data sets. This is this idea of data documentation that came out of our FATE group at MSR, led by Timnit Gebru when she was there for her postdoc. And we put forward this proposal for dataset documentation that was intended to help dataset producers think through responsible AI decisions as they were kind of making decisions and creating their datasets. And also intended to help dataset consumers determine if a dataset was right for their particular needs. So this kind of was it's documentation, but it also is a process in the sense that it's trying to get people to think through all of these things. Of course, we've run some more recent studies looking at how data documentation is done in practice, and there's still kind of big gaps there where people don't even tend to associate data documentation with responsible AI and understand how it's helpful. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but just to kind of hammer this home again, I think that it's really like processes where we need to be focusing our attention.
That's fantastic. Gulnoosh, can I ask you to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. One thing I want to mention is also related to the previous question is that in machine learning, when you are thinking about the process, you're thinking about that there's a data, there's a model, there's the outcome. Most of the issues that people aren't talking about in machine learning in terms of fairness and discrimination, they're focusing on data issues. So there is an unbalanced issue, there is a majority minority groups, and there are patterns that the data is just for the majority group, and that's why the model. Of course, like most of my work, we're focusing only on the model part, but I also agree like the data issues are very important and we have to actually resolve them. So in terms of generation, in terms of like maintenance, I think you have to make sure like this data sheets for data, so that is a very great idea, like to make sure like what we have in the data, what is the distribution, do we have all the stakeholders data in the data set that we are collecting. But also we have to consider privacy. Like if we are collecting data sets as we are collecting right now, we are actually not understanding the privacy of the data. So maybe we have to rethink about like how we are collecting data in order to train the models. because I'm working at this intersection of privacy and fairness, and this is very important in many different domains, I'm thinking like maybe we don't need to have databases as we were thinking before, like centralized data sets to train the models. Maybe we can distribute it among people, that people are responsible towards the data that they have. And maybe in this way, we can actually collect more data. The distribution might be better, more balanced. And then we can also have more kind of applications in different domains because we have more data about people. And about the responsibilities, I think accountability is important. So everyone should be accountable. They should be educated. Of course, we cannot expect individuals to be responsible, but we should expect people to be accountable, right? At the end of the day, like there's an individual deciding about like implementing something or not. And if they are educated, then they will be able to have educated implementations. They know the consequences of what they are doing. So I actually believe in responsibility towards individuals, but of course, we need to have some kind of regulations in place to make sure that like these kind of responsibilities towards the companies, etc., are enforced in some way.
This is great. I may want to come back to this accountability question in a moment, but you will given you're working maybe more closely in the database space as maybe Abol and I are. Do you have thoughts about this notion of, you know, how centralized or not centralized it could be? I mean, both could be, you know, data management doesn't necessarily mean centralized, but it does imply a certain amount of autonomous control or something of data. Do you have comments?
Yeah, I think actually, I really relate to what Jean said before. I think it's very much a combination of, you know, we definitely need to change the state of mind and be more aware of the consequences of the systems that we develop and the effect that they have on people's life. And ideally, I think we want to like embed this state of mind into the system, so it will be able to detect or avoid unwanted cases automatically as possible. So it's kind of you do want to have the system the power to think like what you want to be, what you think, but definitely it cannot be fully autonomous.
Makes sense. Yeah. So maybe I still may want to come back to this accountability thing, but I want to make sure we touch on the next couple of questions here. Just they've been on my mind, which is why I kind of wrote them down this way. But I feel like we have both a breadth and a depth problem in that arguably all of this work is motivated by the impact, usually damaging impact, that technology is having on different communities. Okay. And so if that's the case, then, you know, engaging with those communities, engaging with those applications, and really deeply understanding that seems to be critical. And yet one could argue that we're playing the standard computer science game in many of the papers that are coming out in this space, which is take the familiar data set that the last people, you know, the people you're trying to, you know, the next greatest mousetrap evaluate on some data set. You take the same data set, show a better mousetrap, and then move on. And I've been railing against this kind of a pattern for a long time when I used to work in the science space, you know, where you have to actually go spend time in the lab in an oceanography department as opposed to just claim you can say something about astronomy or oceanography or something. But even here it's even more critical, right? I mean, the entire reason why we're studying these things is it relies on engagement. And so I'm troubled, and I think many folks have talked about how we're troubled by the idea that the entire field is being arguably represented by a handful of 3 or 4 familiar data sets, that frankly, even those, besides representing you know, in some cases, applications that shouldn't have ever existed in the first place, you know, Compass in particular. But moreover, the only reason why they exist is because of, you know, some enterprising computational journalists decided to do a study. And so the fact that we're waiting for that kind of serendipity to happen before we can do our research seems a little bizarre. And so I guess maybe getting around to the actual question here, how do we change this? How do we expand our research engagement to include these other applications and maybe incentivize researchers to actually spend the time doing that, as opposed to banging out the next paper? You know, do we change reviewing committees? Do we change the way we train students? All the above. Katie, do you want to?
Yeah. I love this question. I think it's really, and I'm glad you mentioned astronomy, because I actually think the model for working with big data about humans, can't be astronomy, it needs to be anthropology. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. So anthropology has a history of collecting what I think of actually as big data, like data from many streams, and you do it sort of unobtrusively in many cases, not always, right? But in ethnographic practice. And then you put them together and try and make sense out of this data, right? And to do that, you have to do you have to do a lot of things, but a couple of things that I think are relevant here you have to do. You have to build trust. You have to build trust with the community that you're studying. You have to define what the heck that community is. Defining community is not easy. Then you have to build trust with them. It's called building entree and getting entree. Now, how you would do that in a data, sort of a digital data centered way is different. And I think we have to think about that. I don't think we have good entree building mechanisms at scale, right? But I think that's the analogy we have to be thinking of is what does it mean to build entree with particular, the communities that we're harvesting and extracting this data from, right? It is extractive just as anthropology was. The other thing that I think is useful in the anthropology analogy is that anthropology is deeply tied up with systems of colonialism. And as a discipline, as a field, they have had to grapple with that. Anthropologists have had to grapple with that and try to think about ways to do their discipline differently, such that they are less entangled with the traditions of colonialism. Big data is entangled with traditions of surveillance and state control. And we have to recognize that as a field in order to come up with new methods to move away from and to be reflexive about that entanglement. And so I think we have a similar problem in thinking about power. And so we have to think through what does it look like to be reflective about the history of this tradition of this data gathering that's been used in so many negative ways, such that we can use it for research or for decision-making systems in more responsible ways. So I think that that's going to be differences in how we teach. It's going to be differences in how long all of this research takes. Anthropology is really slow. It takes a really long time, partially because you spend 6 months or a year trying to establish your fieldwork site, right? What if we look at data analysis as not, look, I have this data, I'm just going to take it and do my thing, and it's going to be really fast. Instead, building up relationships in order to both look at the trust and the power question in sort of more reflexive ways. But then we have to relax criteria for tenure. We have to do all kinds of things if research is slower, right? Funding organizations have to be willing to fund something that might not happen for 5 years, right? So essentially, we are not well set up to do this, but I think we can push. And I think the ways that Anthro did that, largely in the 80s and 90s, is quite interesting and instructive.
So I want to broaden out to include others, but just one quick maybe seed for the rest of the conversation is that, I envision there might be collaborative teams where, there's a little chocolate in the peanut butter and there's a little peanut butter in the chocolate or something, where the engineers can contribute to more of a humanistic mode of scholarship, where right now they kind of can't because we don't train them to. And maybe vice versa, though, where people with a critical studies background are able to, join a team that's actually building an engineering solution, something, even though that's not typically what they would do. And I guess I wanted to hear from folks whether that sounded a viable path towards the anthropology model you described, but I'm talking too much. Jen, I was wondering, maybe call on you and see if you had any thoughts about either what I just said or maybe better yet what Katie said.
I was still pondering part of what Katie said that really resonated with me, which was this point that she brought up about building relationships and how this is important for responsible AI. And this actually resonates with me a lot. I think that, if we want to be addressing problems that actually matter in responsible AI, we need to be doing this, in like real collaboration with the people who are on the ground, like working on these problems, right? And this is something that does take a lot of relationship building. Like a lot of the reason why people gravitate towards working on problems like, COMPAS recidivism prediction is that this has already been laid out there. They can just go download the data set. It's easy to do. It doesn't involve actually going out and like talking to people and finding out what their real problems are. But then, you know, this results in the situation we're in now, where we have so many people working on recidivism prediction and, you know, whether someone should get a loan or not. And the solutions that people come up with to these problems just don't really transfer that well to other domains, like partially because, you know, a lot of the problems out there aren't these kind of allocation problems, you get a loan or you don't get a loan, but just also because everything in responsible AI is really context specific. So I think that, you know, building these relationships is really important. I think that, you know, one great example of this in practice is the work that Alexandra Choldachova has done, where she's done really influential work on risk assessment in child welfare. And she did this by actually going out and putting in the time and working hands-on with the people who were building and running child welfare systems. So I think this is a really great example. And it's also something that, you know, we who are working on responsible AI in industry are also very well positioned to do. I hear a lot of arguments these days that you shouldn't be addressing responsible AI from within companies, but I think it's actually really important to have people, have researchers and others like thinking about these problems from within companies, because we are able to build the relationships and get the trust from the people who are building products to work with them hands-on to solve these issues.
On the, you know, I'll sort of combine these two areas, but one was attempted sort of breadth. How do we get new applications? We talked a little bit about that, but there's also, even in the ones that we are working on, which it's all basically the same question, but it's how do we incentivize going deeper? Hal, did you have some reactions to any of this angle of discussion?
I do, but actually I wanted to touch on something that's not the deeper question.
That's fine. Oh, yeah, please.
But the broader question, and this is again sort of keying off something that Katie said, which is sort of this power question. So I think that a lot of, from a 10,000 foot view, I think, you know, machine learning data science is really good at helping scale. Like, I think that's kind of its job, is to like scale processes and scale systems. And generally speaking, the people who need scaling to happen are those who are in a position of power with respect to those over whom they're scaling the technology.
Great point.
And so I think that like the default thing that like gets gravitated toward is like recidivism prediction or loan making, or, you know, who gets a job or who gets into grad school or whatever, right? And these are all questions that are like centered around the people who have power in whatever this dynamic relationship is. And so I think that like when we think about, or at least when I think about the sort of problems that I would be most interested in working on, and the ones where like I'd like to think we can have positive impact with the work that we do, like I want to think about like how can this technology help the people who are not in that like higher position in whatever relationship it is that we're talking about. So like, how do we help people find jobs, or how do we help people like figure out like where to go for a loan, or where to find information or whatever, right? So I think that it's a harder question to answer because it's not just the scaling question. But I think that if we want to have positive impact, like I think that's the way that I'd like to do that. But then, like Jen's example of Alex's work with child welfare, this takes effort, and then this gets back to the question of building trust.
We've talked a little. It's fantastic. We talked a little bit about what might, you know, anti-oppression ML or something look like. You know, what might those problems look like? And it's examples I sort of come up with are, you know, tools that will help you fill out your insurance claim to maximize the chance of a return, right? Sort of an adversarial thing. That, you know, they have massive actuarial science and models working against you. Can we get some kind of distributed thing here? And another example I have that not everybody likes, but parking tickets, right? They're kind of robo lawyer stuff, and they've got lawyer friends that are like, this is a terrible idea, don't do this. But I kind of like it, right? It helps you sort of automate the process of fighting that thing in court, where where you don't. Anyway, so I wonder if there's a category of applications where the technology is being deployed on the other side, you know, against the grain of the power dynamic. That's super interesting. Bernice, did you have thoughts on either breadth or depth or other reactions to this?
Yeah. So my thoughts, I guess, like both for breadth or depth. I was just gonna stretch it depending on what question I was on. But I think, so one thing on depth, I was kind of thinking about, there's different levels of depth. I wasn't quite sure with the question. One, certainly that we talk about a lot is, and we need to continue to talk about, is deeper engagement with the problem. So the kind of context of the problem, as Jen said, and then also those who work in that discipline and who have the expertise in those disciplines. I think that's incredibly important and something that we need to think about as technologists, how we do that better. I think there's also kind of a level of depth, though, with just maybe precision. So how do we collect, more realistic data sets that, maybe include some expertise or have some, are not like so truth or false, like there may be some probabilistic label that's involved. How do we think about depth in these sorts of ways? In picking problems and collecting data that allows us to really get at the nuance of any of these issues, because I think there's a lot of issues when you look underneath the hood of a model and the predictions that model may make, and nuance that's just kind of completely ignored. And so how do we start to think about that nuance, kind of not be satisfied with the idea that our model, has done well on 90% of the data, but it just wildly and for the wrong reasons gave answers for the other 10%. And I think there's great things and, great things that we're thinking about as far as robustness, as far as interpretability and understanding and error analysis and understanding where. I'm always a proponent of kind of evaluation and measurement, so things there as well. And I think that depth is equally important.
It's super interesting. It reminds me of what Hal said earlier about the matrix being handed down from God. It's like, not only is it given to us, it's also assumed to be perfectly correct, right? These are all the labels. And so your notion of maybe there's a little bit of uncertainty around these labels and kind of factor that into the model and go out and collect data more aggressively to represent other areas, even when you're not 100% sure of the veracity of it. My sense is we don't have a lot of tolerance for those kind of sources of noise, but that's the world we're in. That's super interesting. Gulnoosh, anything to add on either this breadth or depth question about or engaging with new applications?
Of course. So I was thinking actually, like one of the, because I'm working on this at this intersection, I think about privacy. If you're looking at the data set that we have, is data set that are publicly available. And that's a good thing because many researchers can focus on working on them and they can compare the results. But unfortunately, at this point, most of the data set that are using computer vision, for instance, or even fairness, the machine learning methods are overfitted to those models and they are comparing with each other, but it doesn't make sense anymore. And if you're thinking about image processing, I'm pretty sure that medical image processing, it's much more important in terms of problem to work on. And even if you're overfitting, those problems is much better than overfitting on character recognition. But the issue is that we cannot really have access to those data sets because of the sensitive natures. And maybe we can think of how we can actually train models, how we can have the data that is not publicly available, but researchers can access to those data sets to train their models without actually seeing the data sets, right? Of course, having some information about a data set is useful when you are designing the model, but sometimes if you can't even having access to the data sets without seeing the data, is useful to work on different domains that is not possible to work on them at this point. Another thing that I want to talk about is that the reason that we are actually focusing on a specific data set is that the communication is hard. As a computer scientist, these data sets are the data sets that people are working on it, and it's easy to work on because you can get familiar with the topic easily. But if you're going to change the domain, you have to work with an expert, and you need to just tackle this issue of communications, that they not understanding you or you not understanding the problem in order to collect data. Power dynamic is also important here. As an assistant professor, how can I actually make time to collect data if I want to collect the data for a new domain, because people are expecting me to be on a tenure track and etc. So it's easier for me. And it's shameful to say that I have to actually think about myself at this point and like not collecting data, although I know that's an important task to do. And that's an issue. Like if we are not changing this kind of things, I don't think we are going to change anything.
Super interesting. So one thing I guess I heard was invest heavily in sort of federated learning types of work in order to be able to expose applications that we otherwise are going to go silently pass in the night because we'll never have access to them. That's
exactly. That's why I'm working on federated learning these days.
I was imagining that might be the part. But the other thing this is super interesting though is that I just want to run one idea by you. You said, the communication is hard, and that's why people sort of cheat towards the simple available data set, not only because it's convenient for them, but it's also because, it's easy, it takes less of a page budget in your paper to communicate to someone else. You can say, oh, well, we used Compass and we used, the adult data set, and then, that's it, and everybody already knows what those are. So I wonder if there's a way to say, if you're writing an applied paper for an applied track, you get a longer page budget, and you're expected to spend another five pages, explaining your interaction with that domain, or your
I also want to
show off what you actually did to learn about that domain and get rewarded for it with a few extra pages and some different reviewing attention or something.
If I can add something to this, is that one of the issues of people who are working on like social good application is that unfortunately, like the data set is new, the problem is new, and that's the interesting aspect to it. But the community are not expecting that they are using, like, for example, logistic regression. Logistic regression is a good model for that particular application, but it's not it's not getting rewarded. So that's why people are not actually working on different domains, although the domains are important, but the community should also change their view about like how publication is working.
Where the novelty can come from needs to be
exactly.
more than just the method. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yuval, from the database perspective, does this sound viable for our conferences?
So I think everyone has a very interesting opinion on this. I see those problems. I think that the breadth problem is not only in our domain. I see it in other domains as well in computer science, right? It's not something new. I actually thought about getting and we hear every now and then about new case of an algorithm treated some group of minority unfairly and so on, and we never get the data from this story. I mean, they're published like on the media, but we don't get the data. So if somehow we were able to convey the message that our research is useful for those application owners and for the users, and maybe we'll be able to get some data from them. And that's, I think it's also important in order to get a deep, for this problem, I think it's important to make everything about the research and the artifacts available as much as possible, and this way, like, try to engage other researchers or other people who are stakeholders to collaborate and then get a deeper results and deeper research.
This is great. So maybe before we wrap up with this maybe final open-ended thing about what, where should students be spending their time, or what kind of how should they engage in this problem? Where should they? I guess when a couple of panels I've been on back in the day were saying that students should stay away from this problem, wait until you have tenure before, because it's too messy for various reasons. It wasn't about responsible AI, but it had some of the similar characteristics about applied work. But on this accountability question, I want to go back to this because it's brought up, and the way I struggle with this sometimes is that we've with a human-oriented process, maybe we can complain about the efficiency, and we can complain about there's bias there too, where judges make different decisions after lunch because their blood sugar is higher than they do before lunch and so on. There's all these things we can point to about that are problems, but accountability we did sort of have, right? It's like, regardless of how you made this decision, you were the one that made it. And so if it screws everything up, then we can come back and say, hey, we think you screwed this up, whether you meant to or not, is what happened. But now we're sort of diffusing that out, right? We've got the engineers that build the model, and there's the people that collected the data, and the people that collected the data will say, well, I didn't ever intend for you to train some model with it. I was collecting for this other purpose. So, and, you know, so yes, you're right. There's a lot of flaws with that data set, but how was I supposed to guess that you might do something wackadoo with it? Meanwhile, the model people were saying, well, you know, whatever, it had the columns you did, and you made a promise to me that those columns were accurate. And so anyway, so everybody sort of, I can imagine where everybody kind of could point figures. I don't really know if any of this has been tested in court yet. It probably will be down the road, but even if it is tested in court, I don't quite know what the answer should be, right? Everybody's to blame. You know, maybe the people that release the product, but then it is a little bit hard for them to be. I mean, I'm very comfortable vilifying Amazon for releasing stupid products as they have many times over the last few years, but you know, even then, it's a pretty high bar to say that they're responsible for every sort of part of the pipeline all the way up. Oh, maybe they are. Maybe that's simple. But anyway, any reactions to that? Of how do we resurrect this notion of accountability when it's now entire teams of people that have nothing to do with each other, that weren't even imagining, you know, they're not connected at all in the design of the program, and yet all of them have kind of a hand in the possible harms. Any reaction? I can't. Maybe I'll call on somebody.
Excuse me, Bill. Before we move on to the accountability, I know that we in the VLDB community, in the database community, we have been working on these problems, and we have Abraham here. He wants to comment on some of his work he's done. So if you want to unmute and talk, Abraham, you're mute. You're still mute. Let me see if I can unmute him.
Thank you. I'm in the hotel in Copenhagen, so the internet is not great, so I keep missing some things. Basically, so we had a paper for this year's VLDB where we worked with New York City Department of Education to collect data about New York City grades and test scores for a kind of a fairness type test. And I think one really important point is I also noticed this in the IRB trainings we had to do. We couldn't give the data set out. We had to sign, we had to go through the IRB and sign NDA. But one really important point is it's important to make sure the people who benefit from your research are not AI researchers, but are the people who the data is really about. And that's, I think, a really key point that I remember, that I think when you collect this kind of data, it's important that the students who we have the data about, hopefully the middle schools even benefit very directly, not only the same population, but these same students will hopefully benefit from helping us do it. And I know Irene Lowe at Stanford also does something similar with her research. She's working directly, I think it's with one of the school districts in California to help rebuild the system. And it's really important that we make sure that the targets of our fairness research are in fact the people who the data is about, because otherwise we're kind of using them to help other people, which is kind of exploiting them further.
Fantastic point. In fact, one remark on that, you know, it's actually encoded in the code of ethics of like the American Statistical Association, probably some others, you know, it's explicit in there that the subjects represented in the data are one of your stakeholders that you have an obligation to be responsible to. And yet the data science kind of meme, you know, drew some distance between that, right? We sort of inherited this data set from somewhere, and so it's okay to work with it. And we're slowly bringing the culture back to what statisticians I think have been doing really forever. They've been sort of aware of this, so it's a fantastic point.
And it is also a lot harder to do research this way. Like, we're going to have to get rid of the data in, I think, a month or so, and we can't really share it with the community. And we have to spend, you know, half the paper explaining what the data set is. But I think it's the responsible way to do this kind of research. So
I like this page better today. I'm gonna push on that. Jen, did you want to say a few words about accountability?
Yeah, sure. So jumping back to the question that you were asking a moment ago about accountability, I think there are a couple of different levels here. So you were kind of talking about accountability for AI systems that are actually released and having impact on people. And this is a big question. And I think you're exactly right that there are all of these different parties. I think there are some regulations that will be coming into play here. Europe is putting forward these new regulations around AI. And one of the things that they're trying to do is very clearly define all of these different stakeholders who are involved in different stages of building an AI system and who is responsible for who. But because we have kind of an audience at this conference of people who are writing research papers, I also want to make the point that this kind of chain of responsibility goes back even like a few steps further than what you were talking about. And, you know, a lot of the AI systems that are being implemented and affecting people are based on ideas that are coming from the research community. And this is a problem where we also have, we have a big kind of lack in accountability, in the sense that people are writing research papers, thinking of them as something that is kind of, abstract, blue sky, not out there affecting the real world. And so not thinking, not communicating clearly about the limitations of their work in ways that it shouldn't be used, and all of these other issues to do with responsible AI. And this is something that I would love to see changed. I'm one of the program co-chairs of NeurIPS this year, and this is something that we've been thinking about a lot in the NeurIPS community in the past couple of years. Last year, there was this experiment introducing a requirement to include broader impact statements in papers. This year, we tried out a slight variant of this, where we included a paper checklist that all authors had to fill out in their submitted PDF that gets at different questions around different aspects of responsible AI, including, privacy, consent issues, but also broader impact limitations and all of this. And I think that we do need to be taking more responsibility in the research community, even for people who are not working directly with products, not doing, not building things that are directly impacting end users right now, just at being more upfront about limitations and ways that our work should not be used.
Fantastic. Thanks for the reminder about how far NeurIPS is ahead of the game in some of these areas.
Just to add on to Jen's, I've been also thinking a lot about, on the research side, there's kind of two things that you want to do, right? You might want to do applied work for a particular task, and engineer, create a solution for that. And then there's also kind of, generalizability, right? And trying to build a system that would work on these sorts of problems, and this is an example of a problem that we're using to demonstrate that. And I think one thing I'm really curious about is what separating those two look like getting back to what, when we think about generalization and using a test set to kind of measure generalization, is that enough? That it's on a particular data set, how maybe we have more strict requirements on how many data sets that would be, and on kind of separating the idea of creating some architecture that generalizes to these particular statistical patterns in the data, versus solving the solution for this data set or this task.
Makes a lot of sense. I can picture sort of reproducibility efforts that have come about in certain conferences, SIGMOD in particular. There's maybe a version of that you could do here, where it's like you somehow have to register your holdout set ahead of time or something, and the conference itself kind of helps you make your case that you can generalize or not. Anyway, not a very well-formed idea, but you're right. There's something fishy about just saying here's one extra data set, therefore I generalize to the entire family that we're talking about. It doesn't quite hold water, does it? So I guess we only have a few minutes left. Any final thoughts from folks? Katie, can I pick on you to see if we can summarize any of this, or what's the takeaway? And I guess one of the framings I had was, what should students work on if they're in the space, but you can ignore that if you want.
Yeah, I want to go back to Jen's sort of opening point about process and practice, because I think that is such a huge part of the answer here. And so actually, I think this is not on students, right? There are things that students can do here, but this is on the research community, right? Part of reviewing needs to be reviewing for good methods, but good methods is a bigger question, I think, than it has been. Part of funding committees has to be thinking through these things, and then part of tenure committees has to be allowing for the time and space to build community partnerships and things like that. So this is all process structure stuff for those of us who are tenured to worry about, right? And those of us with that power, we need to be making these changes in our departments and on our reviewing committees, and props to NeurIPS for being out in the lead on that. Yes, and then students hopefully are coming up in labs where this is part of being a good scholar, right? This is part and parcel of good research, and I'm hopeful that that's the kind of change that this community, that lots of related communities can make. Because I think we're at an inflection point where people want to do better, and so that's exciting, right? And that's so yeah, that's kind of what I see is process that can be put into place.
Fix the process and then invite the students to participate in the fixed process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's-
Hal, did you have some thoughts on this?
I feel like we should go back to someone else definitely after me, because I only have sort of a minor thing to say, which is that I think that we can think a lot more about the education side of stuff here too. Like, and as someone who spends time both in industry and academia, like it's easy to think about education meaning like, you know, I teach undergrad machine learning, like what do I teach there? And up until a couple of years ago, I didn't teach anything about like collecting data, like annotating data. And then I talk to people who get undergrad degrees and go off and do machine learning in the real world, and that's like 90% of their job, right? And they're not at all trained to do this. And so I think that's a major like gap in the way that we educate people. But I also think it's important to realize that many people who work in data science and machine learning have pivoted from another career, and so are not necessarily taking undergrad databases or undergrad machine learning or whatever. They're actually, I don't know what they're doing, but they're learning all this stuff from like online sources and perhaps like Coursera and things like that. And so I think that when we think about education, we need to think about it a lot more broadly than, you know, just what am I teaching to the, you know, 100 students who are taking a class from me this semester.
Great point. Any final thoughts from folks?
I just want to echo something about accountability of the researchers, because what Jen mentioned about the broader impact, I love the idea that it's like it forced people to think about like whether their research can impact other like aspect of a society. But I would just give you one example of like how people can actually use the research in a bad way. I was like at the beginning of the fairness conferences, people were talking about different fairness notions. And at the time, like I was in Europe and I met a lawyer, and she told me like I'm actually using the methods that are published in computer science as a fairness notion at court. And I was so frustrated to hear like they actually use these methods while like we are actually playing with the methods, with the data set and see how it goes. So like having this broader impact and actually mentioning it in the paper that it's not the only fairness method and like it is very context dependent, that's very important, I guess.
So some of this is just about good science, right? I think you know, we don't have the best track record in computer science of being the most rigorous science in the world sometimes. It's so just being able to state your own limitations and be able to bend over backwards to explain where you fall down is not something we've developed a culture for, like you have, say, in physics or something. So that's interesting. Well, let me thank you all again. I mean, I feel a little bit selfish here because I got an enormous amount of material and things to think about and inspiration, especially for even proposals we're in the middle of writing here. So I appreciate for the really rich conversation, and hopefully there's some connections made amongst us. And again, there'll be a recording online that folks can we can point to and cite and so forth. So if there's no other final comments, I'll thank you again and let you escape back to your rooms at home where we're all in prison still. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you
organizing
very
this.
much.
Pleasure.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate the time commitment. Bye all.
Yeah.
Bye bye.